Well, hello, and welcome to the second instalment of the Fabian series brought to you by the LSE Debate Society. My name is Keshav, and I'm the president of the Debate Society. Thank you so much for coming along today. LSE Debate has a very successful competitive programme, but we are keen to try and expand this into acting as a forum to discuss the most pressing issues of the day. It's no surprise that we chose to name this series after the Fabian Society, the same Fabian Society that founded the LSE. In its early days, the LSESU was incredibly political, and they hosted fortnightly debates, which came to be known as the Clare Market Parliament. That is the spirit that we hope to revive today at this debate. The first instalment of the Fabian series was focused on whether or not we should have a second referendum on Brexit. Today, we turn our attention to climate change. The issue of climate change has never been more in the public eye than it is today, and a movement that can take quite a lot of credit for that is Extinction Rebellion. Anyone in London, or indeed many other large cities around the world, will know that they often engage in disruptive tactics to try and create change and bring attention to this pressing issue. Tonight, we'll examine those methods and ask if this is the best way to tackle climate change. Let me now introduce our guests for today. Firstly, we have Dr. Ellie Chowns, a Green Party MEP. She's been involved in politics since 2015. She became a councillor in 2017, re-elected in 2019, and earlier this year she was elected as an MEP into the European Parliament. She's spoken out vociferously about Extinction Rebellion's right to protest. Secondly, we have Dr. Emily Grossman, a science communicator and populariser. She's been the resident expert on the Alan Titchmarsh Show and has been a panellist on Sky One TV. She's one of the most recognisable faces from within Extinction Rebellion, and she's addressed their march in London in October. She's also appeared on the BBC, debating the merits of the movement. She's used her scientific expertise to co-found Scientists for XR. Our final guest is Ms. Sarah Lunnan, a coordinator at Extinction Rebellion, who often acts as an official spokesperson for the movement. She's claimed that Extinction Rebellion is the only way to get the climate on the agenda. In her role as a coordinator, she is frequently on the ground in XR protests. Before I hand over to our moderator, Hamza, it's my pleasure to introduce our academic chair for this evening, Dr. Richard Perkins, an Associate Professor of Environmental Geography at the LSE. Dr. Perkins is also an Associate of the Grantham Institute, has a PhD from Cambridge University, and his research focuses on sustainable finance. He's also the Programme Director of the Master's Programme in Environmental Policy and Regulation at the LSE. Finally, let me introduce our moderator for this evening, Hamza Tariq Chowdhury. Hamza is pursuing an IR degree with his research focusing on global policy systems designed to mitigate existential risk. He has previously worked for the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. He's currently co-authoring a book on non-violent Pashtun movements in South Asia. In addition, Hamza is a highly skilled competitive debater, having ranked in the top 10 English as a second language speakers at last year's World Championships. He will go on to represent LSE at this year's World Championships later this month in Thailand, and we're all very excited to see how he does there. Hamza also has extensive moderating experience. He has moderated discussions involving the Pakistani Education Minister, the Pakistan Information Minister, as well as prominent activists and prominent academics. Hamza, thank you so much for agreeing to moderate this event, and over to you.
So we had a bit of a tussle about, let's say, 10 minutes about how this discussion is going to go. And one of the conclusions that we share now is that we're going to have a set of opening remarks by two of our speakers, and then perhaps our third speaker will chip in with a bit of a discussion. Tentatively speaking, we might also have opening remarks from our third speaker. Let's see how this goes. I'll first hand the floor over to Ms. Alan, please.
Thank you. So, today, our government continues to fund the carbon economy and has no emergency plan for the risks that we face. And the science is clear. We are in the 6th mass extinction event and face catastrophe if we are not radical and swift to act. Life is dying around the world. Our seas are poisoned, acidic and rising. Flooding and desertification will render vast tracts of land uninhabitable, with many today not knowing if they should stay in their homes or if they leave, where they will go. And the brutal truth is, it's going to get worse. We are on course for 4 degrees of heating, with a risk of over 7. Such a world is unimaginable. We are sending our children into an unknown planet, for no human has ever lived before in such a world at such temperatures. And there will be no hiding place from the impacts in our country or anywhere. We will not go from here straight to catastrophe. On the way, we will lose everything we cherish: our NHS, schools, farming, and yes, those we love. And the breakdown of our climate has begun. Our power, finance, manufacturing and food supplies will not be able to withstand the extreme weather shocks that will be our common future. At a single degree of heating, our transport systems have ground to a halt from flooding or heat. Our farmers struggle to plant or harvest crops, and our hospitals in the summer buckle with the vulnerable suffering extreme temperatures. And around this country, homes are being abandoned to rising sea levels. The willful complicity displayed by previous governments has shattered faith in our democracy. The calls and evidence for action have been cast aside. The common interest ignored in favour of short-term gain and private profits. Extinction Rebellion has highlighted what we face. We have not made it worse. We are the last generation with the opportunity to act. We act in peace, with a ferocious love in our hearts, and we act on behalf of life, and I believe that we are a force for good.
We will stick with opening remarks from one of our 3 speakers. The way that we've thought of sort of structuring this discussion is to take the 3 broad claims that XR makes, which everyone I hope knows about, which are, broadly speaking, tell the truth, act now and move beyond politics. And then look at how we can frame Extinction Rebellion within the broader frame of social movements and fight against climate change within those 3 objectives. So let's start with tell the truth. I want to bring you in here, Dr. Grossman, as someone who has co-founded Scientists for XR, someone who has great expertise. One, could you give us a general overlay of where the science is right now? And 2, perhaps could you also touch upon this accusation that often comes in opposition to claims made by XR of fear-mongering?
Yeah, this is a really important issue, and I have to say before we start that XR is a decentralized movement. You've probably heard that phrase a million times. What does it actually mean? What it means is that XR is full of lots of individuals who are taking part in the movement because of our commitment to the 3 aims, the 3 objectives, which is to tell the truth, to act now, so to bring carbon emissions to net zero by 2025, ideally as soon as possible, and to go beyond politics and to call a citizens' assembly to help us to make decisions about how we're going to live our lives going forward. Aside from that, within Extinction Rebellion, there are a lot of different voices, and there is no sort of centralised messaging, really, about exactly what it is that we should be saying, because there's no actual absolute truth about what's going to happen. That's really, really important. So what we can say as a truth, is what has happened so far and where we are right now. What we can't say as a truth is what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, or in 10, 20, 40, 50 years' time. And that's where I think a lot of the stickiness comes in, because some of that is open to what's called the precautionary principle, to talking about the probabilities, the risks of what could happen next. And you're right, some of the messaging can, and again, like I say, there's a lot of individuals who are doing things from, everyone from the same motivation, which is that we all know that the truth is absolutely horrendous and that we have to take action. That is like a no-brainer. There's no debate around that. But what that truth will lead to, people express in different ways. And I think that's where we come unstuck sometimes. Because the role of the scientist, traditionally, has been to be, I'm not going to use the word conservative because it's not true, but to stick with what's absolutely known and absolutely unequivocal about what we are right now and what we have right now. And what scientists have been promised for decades, if not centuries, is that if we tell the truth, if we say impartially, unemotionally, and with total clarity, without exaggeration, and without an interpretation of the truth, that governments and the media will listen to that truth and will act appropriately. That the media will report on that truth as truth, and that the governments who are we're the mouthpiece, but the people who are there to take action will act appropriate to that truth. So what we're seeing now is 40 years worth of scientists telling the truth without exaggeration or fear-mongering or scaremongering, whatever these phrases are, and not being listened to. We're seeing the media not reporting that truth as truth. We're seeing at best it being sort of ignored, at worst it being actively covered up by fossil fuel companies, for example. So we're in a situation now where scientists are kind of stepping forward and going, well, hang on a minute, we've done what we said we'd do, which is to kind of speak calmly and rationally and say, this is what we know. We don't know exactly what might happen next, but we've got a very likely risk of this or a 67% certainty of this, which translates into public understanding as scientists don't really know, it's probably not going to happen, and we get ignored. So that's why scientists such as myself are coming out onto the streets and joining protest movements, because it's against what we've been trained to do. But there are now scientists, in fact, as scientists of Extinction Rebellion, we've actually created a scientist declaration in support of non-violent direct action against government inaction over the climate and ecological emergency. And in this declaration, we set out what the truth is, which I'll tell you in just a moment. But we also set out that the fact that we've been simply telling the truth for 40 years, no one has listened and no one has acted. So therefore, we need to now go a step further. Not as scientists, because it's not what we do as scientists, not what we're supposed to do. But as human beings, we now have a moral imperative as humans who have families, who have relatives who are going to grow up in a world in 10, 20, 30, 40 years' time. We have a moral obligation, because we know that truth, we have a moral obligation to now heighten the way that we communicate that truth and what we do to draw people's attention to that truth. So that's where the trouble comes in, because when scientists communicate absolute truth, there is an interpretation by the public that because we're not screaming and shouting and saying, oh my God, everyone's going to die, that therefore that truth can't be as bad as all that. So I want to express to you that I'm not a climate scientist. I'm a science communicator. I've got a PhD in cancer research, so I'm an expert in molecular biology and genetics. However, I've got a degree in natural sciences from Cambridge University and a PhD, so I've been trained in how to analyse information, analyse data, research, go to primary sources, look at peer-reviewed articles, and basically find out what is true and what is, excuse my French, bullshit. So, what I did as a science communicator, do you want me to, am I talking too much? I talk too much, it's fine. I've got shit loads I can say, excuse my language. Oh my God, I talk too much, I swear too much. And this is not on BBC now, great. So what I did as a science communicator is I went to the April Rebellion knowing very little about climate change. I went to support my partner, who was drumming in the samba band. And I went, what's going on? This is ridiculous. This can't be as bad as all that. It can't really be, oh my God, all these claims, all this scaremongering. I felt really uncomfortable, which I'm sure a lot of the public do as well. Some of you might do. So I was like, okay, I've spent my life in search of the truth, in search of facts, in search of information, and in search of making sure other people know the truth. So I was like, okay, I'm going to turn my focus to finding out the truth about this, such that I can decide for myself whether or not this is a movement I want to be part of. Because for sure, climate change is real, but it can't be as bad as that. So I went along, and since that day, back in April, I've dedicated my life. I've kind of stepped away from my other projects. I'm a freelancer, I get to do that. And I thought, okay, I'm going to really research into this crisis. And I can honestly say that since that day, back in April, I have barely had a good night's sleep. Because what I found was that the truth is actually, yes, as bad as all that, and a whole lot worse. And the fact is that, yes, we've got to be careful with how it's communicated. There's a difference between saying, this is where we are now, and as a result, 6 billion people are going to die. That is not a truth. That is an opinion based on some scientific evidence of what not probably will, but could happen. And that absolutely could happen based on where we are.
On that, so I want to bring you in, Dr. Chan. So I agree with Dr. Grossman insofar as the scientific truth is out there, and perhaps with the notable exception of the United States president, most people seem to agree with what the truth on climate change is. However, having said that, in the decentralized movement, as Dr. Grossman said, there's a lot of varying interpretations of what the implication of said scientific truth is. So, for example, with the Green Party, we see their manifesto. We know where they stand with net zero emissions by 2030. We know what their stance on climate change is, insofar as it's a centralized organization, so there's a central messaging. Do you think with XR, because it's decentralized, because someone can legitimately stand up and say, I am from XR, 6 billion people will be dead by the end of the 21st century, there's an inherent weakness in XR as a decentralized movement that perhaps more organized movements don't have?
I think that can be a weakness, but I think that centralised structures can also be a weakness too. So it is shades of grey, to be honest, and there are examples in XR. I think the 6 billion claim is one of them. My understanding is that there isn't scientific evidence to support that, and there was a whole more or less segment on that, which was very interesting.
To that, because actually there is more to it than that, but
let's not get too distracted. So that is one, and there have been examples of public actions that have, in my view, alienated more people than they brought along to the court. But I think XR has been incredibly successful in pushing climate up the agenda. Now, as an individual, I've got a bit of a kind of gut reaction against absolutes. So if somebody says, no one's doing anything about climate and hasn't done anything for the last 40 years, I kind of think, well, I've been campaigning on climate for the last 30 years and UK emissions have gone down and that people have been doing this, that and the other. But actually, the truth is, no one's been doing anywhere near enough in this country on climate and in all rich nations. And so, in fact, to say no one's doing anything is closer to the truth than to say we're doing enough, right? So XR, I think, and also Greta Thunberg, both of them have been sort of messengers that have crystallised the climate message in a simplified way. But that has worked. That's absolutely undoubted. You've seen the stats about the level of public concern about climate change in this country from 18 months ago up till now, where the majority of the population say it's a key issue for them and it's going to influence how they vote. That simply wasn't the case 2 years ago. It isn't just XR and Greta Thunberg, it's also been David Attenborough, for example. Different messengers work better for different audiences, but the combination of those has been incredibly powerful and, on balance, has done an enormous kind of public service. So, you know, when I got arrested 6 weeks ago defending XR's right to protest, I hadn't actually participated in any XR actions myself. I've chosen a different path, right? I've chosen to work within the political system. But I fundamentally defend XR's right to protest, sometimes disruptively. And I also defend the efficacy of doing that.
Yeah, I actually want to bring in Ms. Madden for a second on this. So part of the truth is what is happening, and then part of the truth is why it's happening. And I saw this fascinating discussion that you had on Newsnight with Dr. Miles Allen also present. And part of the disagreement between you and Dr. Miles Allen, who has been part of the IPCC reports, has been that the fundamental cause, one, isn't necessarily capitalism, but two, even if it is capitalist forces, there is more value in utilizing the capitalist forces to engineer climate change efforts than to not engineer climate change efforts. So insofar as the truth of what is actually behind this is concerned, what are your conclusions about that?
So me and Miles Allen actually had a very interesting conversation in the green room before we went on to Newsnight, and we did discuss that in some depth. And pretty much the point of dispute between myself and Miles Allen was not about the severity of the impacts of climate change. And in fact, Miles Allen, in a very sciencey way, refused to think about what the impacts of the physics of the warming climate were going to be on the economics, on finance, on people. He was pretty much saying, I can tell you what's going to happen if you add more C into the atmosphere, but I cannot tell you how people are going to react to it. But my feeling is that we don't have time to change the system, and we need to use the system we have to address the problem that we are facing. My feeling on that is that the system we currently have is the system that is killing us. An extractive economy based on debt-based money and an ever-expanding GDP. It is not possible to reduce carbon emissions while we expand the amount of energy we need to use. And there seems to be no evidence anywhere that you can decouple economic growth from energy use. There's a very recent paper in Nature about that. So we are going to have to radically change the system we are living with if we want to reduce our CO2 emissions. And that is, I mean, it's obvious. What we're doing is killing us in multiple ways, from air pollution to what's going to happen to our farming. Let's not even get into the social issues of rising levels of obesity. Every £1 in 10 in the NHS is spent on obesity. There's a number of ways that the system we live in is killing us. We need to change it. That, it seems to me, is a fundamental truth. And one of the very interesting things I think that the people I'm looking at right now can do is to start looking at what that transformation looks like. How do we move from here to a system which does not harm the planet? What does a system of planetary repair look like? And that is the truth. That is what we need. And that is what people like myself are looking for from people like you.
Yeah. Dr. Grossman, I want to bring you in on this. So part of it is the factual truth of things, which is the system is killing us. And then part of it is the emotional internalization of the truth, which is that you have to convince a non-insignificant number of people that the system is killing us. Intuitively speaking, when someone comes up to me and says, what you're doing is killing us, I don't tend to respond very positively. As a science communicator, how do you navigate that problem?
Well, I think it's to me it's really clear, because it comes all the way right the way back to what we were just talking about this whole 6 billion thing. And I know you said it's sort of a side point, but it's very representative of actually a lot of the way that people can disengage from this stuff. Is that it comes to a very simple word: will versus might. That's all it comes down to. So Roger Hallam said 6 billion people will die. The truth is 6 billion people might die. Simple as that. And it's quite likely that they will. But that is where we're coming unstuck, because that is where, what you said about trying to convince people the system is killing you. The system is not killing you. The system might kill you, and it might kill your kids, and it's more likely, again, to kill your grandchildren. But the problem is when people hear will, or people hear is going to, or people hear definitely this, or it can come across as kind of like, well, we don't know what to believe because this is so extreme, you can't possibly know all that. If you can't possibly know all that, if you don't know all of that, then what other bits do you know? So, yes, a top climate scientist, professor, director of the Climate Impact Research Centre in Potsdam, Professor Johan Rockström, did say specifically that he himself, as a climate expert, could not conceive how a 4-degree world, which is where we are projected to get to in 2010, on the emissions that we're on now, and they are not going down, and I'll come to that UK emissions coming down thing in a minute, because it's true, but it's irrelevant. And I'll tell you why. But the fact is, we're heading towards 4 degrees, or as Sarah said, some projections are higher, but we need to know scientifically what's probably going to happen. Most likely is 4 degrees, where we are right now. Yeah, or could be up to 7, but we've got to be careful. We can't say it's going to be 7. It could go to 7, but the likelihood right now is it'll be around 4. That in itself is awful. Johan Rockström, this professor I was telling you about, said, I quote, that he cannot conceive how a 4-degree world, by the end of the century, could have a carrying capacity of more than about 8 billion, or possibly even half of that. That's 4 billion. We are heading towards a population of 10 or 11 billion by the end of the century. So what he is saying, specifically, and he is a world expert in this, is that he cannot imagine, he's not saying it's going to happen, he's not saying 6 billion people are going to die, but what he's saying is that knowing everything he knows, being a world expert that he is, looking at all the data, he can't imagine how this planet we're going to be on could be able to sustain more than 4 or 8 billion people. That is a death of 3 to 7, 3 to 6 billion people. Now, the difference, for me as a communicator, it's about saying, this is likely to happen. This is possible to happen. If you're going to get on a plane that's likely to crash, are you going to get on it? Or are you only going to not get on it if it's definitely going to crash? Because that's what we're talking about. And to me, that's where, as a scientist, that's where I sit, which is that we've got to be very careful with the wording we use. And that's all it comes down to. So as soon as we change it, instead of by the middle of the century, billions of people are going to be flooded, the actual truth, with the actual projections, is that by 2050, 300 million homes across the globe are going to be flooded at least once a year.
Yeah.
So that is a truth. To then say societal collapse is going to follow is not a truth. To say societal collapse is likely to follow as a result because of knock-on effects is a truth. And that, I believe, is going to get the public more on board with actually, it's not scaremongering, it's not just random, scary, alarmist stuff. This is genuine truth, and this is fear of the scientists who know the truth, saying, we know this truth, and we're scared that if we don't listen to what's going on, what could happen is X, Y, and Z. Societal collapse, civil unrest, queues for food, in this country. And it's already starting to happen with the flooding.
Yeah. Okay. I do want to bring Dr. Chowns in on this, which is that going back to this foundational truth that assuming that there's so many significant impacts of the system, and the system is indeed killing us and is most probably going to kill us, how do you reconcile that with, in all fairness, being a participant in such system? You're running as a member of parliament, you're already an MEP, so are you part of the system that is killing us? And do you think that it's systemic reform that we need, or there's something that we can do internally within the system?
We're all part of the system, that's the problem. None of us are kind of remote from it. I mean, in my personal life, 17 years ago, I moved to the countryside to Herefordshire to live in an intentional organic farming community where we grow a lot of our own food, where we live together as a community of about 20 households, partly in an aim to reduce my own personal environmental footprint, to model that kind of, to live that type of life of working more collectively with others, living more on the land. And I couple that with, yes, being absolutely, totally engaged in the political system. And that is a decision that I took more recently, 5 years ago, because I saw what was happening in my country. I saw the rise of UKIP in particular, which was what really drove me to get involved in electoral politics. And I thought, I cannot stand on the sidelines shouting at the radio anymore. This system is going totally the wrong direction. Now, our political system is absolutely broken. If it was less broken, then people like me, people like these, would have more of a voice. And we might have made a little bit more progress, but that's not guaranteed. So we do need to change the system at all sorts of levels. But in terms of the ecological impact, I think one of the really interesting things about the XR message, as I've understood it, is that there's very much an emphasis on system change. Because a lot of environmental messaging over the 30 years that I've been involved as an environmental campaigner, from my teenage years as a kind of Friends of the Earth activist, that sort of thing, quite a lot of it has actually been about personal changes that you make in your own life, switching off the remote control on the telly or whatever it is. And actually, that isn't going to change things. Radical system change is what we need. And actually, that's what the Green Party stands for. Because we've said for decades that measuring progress using this outrageously oversimplified metric of GDP, which measures so many things that aren't important or that are actively negative and doesn't measure so many things that are important, is taking us down the wrong path.
Yep.
So, I'm not a complete revolutionary. I don't go out there saying, overthrow the system, revolution today. But I do believe we need fundamental system change, and you have to engage in politics to do that. Not least because you have to bring people along with you. Now, XR has done an incredible job, actually, and the school strikes too, with a particular demographic. But XR has done a great job of involving people from all walks of life, all kind of backgrounds, all generations, with a kind of sense of urgency, generated in fact by this kind of existential fear in many ways. But that sense of urgency has inspired people in a way that, you know, I haven't managed to inspire quite so many people to come out knocking on doors with me in sort of rural villages or delivering leaflets as part of the political system. There is some overlap, and I think there's some sort of synergy there. But yeah, XR's done a great job of bringing people along and creating that sense of urgency. But actually, I find that you have got to do that thing of knocking on doors, talking to people that aren't part of your normal circle, talking to people that aren't quite ready to hear these messages because they're interested in, you know, their son's football match on the weekend, like my son, their Christmas decorations and so forth. And actually, we do need to engage people in conversation. And for me, that's what electoral politics is about. So I see there being a real synergy between the two. And they're all part of an effort, perhaps not to overthrow the system in a violent spasm, but certainly to fundamentally overturn it.
Yeah, that's actually a good segue because I want to come back to Ms. Lam. So if the truth is things are really bad and things change if you fundamentally change the system, I want to talk about XR internationally a bit. So if the model for ACT now is non-violent civil disobedience, you chain yourself to a bus stop, say, or a building or whatever in London, you get arrested, you're maybe out in a few months' time. If I do this in Pakistan, things don't quite work out so rosy. So how does the non-violent civil disobedience model work internationally for you?
So within this country, if you choose to take action in this country, you do so in an incredibly privileged environment because this country, as we demonstrated, Ellie taking the case to the High Court, as she demonstrated, there is still the rule of law, and we can hold our police and our governments to account in some ways. So to take action in the United Kingdom is very different from taking action in other parts of the world. And indeed, we have seen recently the death of environmentalists across the world, you know, especially in, oh my God, brain's gone dead, Amazon, Brazil, thank you. Especially in Brazil, you know, people are being killed in Brazil for trying to defend and protect the environment. So to take action in this country, you are able to do so in a relatively safe environment, and also depending on your class and your race as well, also impacts on how safe you are. And my feeling is that as a middle class white woman, I actually have a duty to take action because I can. And because I know and understand what is happening, I cannot stand by and not act.
Yeah.
So that is what is causing me to act. Partly because I can and because other people cannot.
Yeah.
So I totally accept that it is not possible for everybody across the globe to act in this way. But I can put pressure on my government, and I can start putting pressure on my government to say, when you are hosting COP in Glasgow next year, you can start talking about global carbon. You can start saying we need global carbon by 2030. Because let's be reasonable, what we now need is the impossible to happen. And that can then start putting pressure on other countries and also on our international institutions. Because very carefully, our international institutions are insulated from democratic pressure. We want to go and start putting pressure on the IMF and what they decide to fund, and when they start to restructure companies. As citizens of this globe, it's almost impossible to pressurise the IMF, but we can pressurise our governments to start shifting what those international institutions are doing. So yes, you're right, not everybody can act in this way, but those people who can have a moral duty to do so.
Dr. Grossman, I want to bring you in on this because you recently had a small memorial outside St. Paul's for environmental journalists. It's quite unfortunate, and again, this is all from a preference. So, for example, I come from a country where people actually have to put in their Facebook bio, climate change believer, is where the state of climate change discussion is back home. So in places like those, and again, you look at Pew Attitude surveys from 2008, 2012 again, 2016 again. A lot of people in those countries don't even believe in the existence of man-made climate change, much less something to do about it. So again, very similar question. If you are at literal risk of death or fatal harm by talking about climate change in many of these cases, what do you do outside of international pressure from your own countries?
I mean, I can't speak to the international movement. I can only speak in support of the scientists in this country. As you say, we're very lucky that in this country that we can protest, we can do these kind of things, and yes, come up against the law, and that you're not at risk of death. I mean, as you said, I was part of a vigil with the XR journalists looking at environmental correspondents in different countries across the globe who have been killed as a result of trying to expose deforestation or other environmental issues. And it is a real massive problem. But yeah, we are very lucky that here we can actually come out to the streets and speak truth. And we've got, on the scientist declaration I was telling you about earlier, about the scientists who are now actually supporting civil disobedience, which is for a scientist to do that, that's unheard of. We've got 1,600 signatures. And those scientists are from at least 30 different countries across the globe. And yes, you're right, maybe in some of those countries, those scientists can't physically go out onto the streets and do that because they might get killed. The journalists can't do that, they might get killed. But that's why something like Extinction Rebellion that brings these people together through a community where we've got these 1,600 signatures that we're hoping to publish, that are on our website, that are basically saying, okay, we can't go out into the streets, but we are adding our names to say that we are supporting those of you, the scientists of the science community, who are going out and doing that. And that's incredibly powerful. And that's something that's just never happened before. I mean, we've had science declarations before. We've had the 11,000 scientists who said that this is clear and unequivocal, human-caused, climate, absolute emergency, catastrophic impact if we don't act now. But what we haven't had before is scientists saying we have to actually not just tell the government to act, but we are going to come onto the streets and we're going to condone ourselves and our loved ones actually as scientists in our white coats lying in the street like I did during the rebellion in October and saying we're not going to move until you take action. And yeah, you're right, that's something that we have real freedom and liberty to do that in this country. So because of that, as Sarah said, those of us who can have to, because those people who can't, they don't have that option. But it has to happen. And it's not enough for people just to know. It's not enough just to briefly come back to Ellie's point about to say that greenhouse gas emissions in this country are falling. Yes, they are, but that doesn't include shipping, that doesn't include aviation, and it doesn't include embedded emissions. Embedded emissions are, I'm sure you know, emissions in the products that we consume, that we eat, drink, wear, use, that are flown in from abroad. It doesn't include any of that. It also doesn't include subsidies. So our government invested £2.5 billion over the last 5 years in subsidies of fossil fuels in other countries, mostly in low and middle income countries. And it doesn't include investments, as Sarah talked about from the City of London. 15% of global carbon emissions come from investments from city banks that have their headquarters in the City of London. So, yes, it's all very well saying, oh, we're doing our bit here, we're lowering our carbon emissions. It's not true, and it's a straw man argument. It's complete nonsense, and it's completely irrelevant. And what we should be doing is far, far, far bigger than all of that.
Yeah. So Dr. Chams, as a politician, you're probably familiar with the idea of you asking a country to do something and then they don't do it. Like this is just like international relations and the concept of sovereignty for you. So if the mechanism to get countries in the developing world to change their modes of behavior economically and politically is just talking to them and perhaps in the worst case sanctioning them, this isn't working out for human rights abuses. Do you think there's a chance this might work out for environmental change?
That's not actually a part of the debate, as I see it, actually. I mean, to stand back, the kind of binary idea of sort of developed world and developing world, I think we've moved away from that quite a bit. And I was reminded of the wonderful Hans Rosling by something somebody said earlier, who always said, make the impossible possible. And that's what we're trying to do, all of us in our different ways in terms of tackling climate change. And he also made some very excellent points about the world is much more complex than these kind of old boxes that we used to have. Now, we see, since I first started campaigning on climate change, China's emissions have gone up through the roof. But, as Emily says, that's not consumed by Chinese people, that's consumed by us, because Chinese products are shipped over here, and so we might have gone down from 10 to 7 tons per person or whatever, but there's all these embedded emissions in products that are produced elsewhere. Now, we have a responsibility to take responsibility for those emissions, but it would be totally unjust to kind of turn around and say, oh well, you Chinese people, you're the problem here, because actually that is totally not the case. I think we have a very specific responsibility here in this country, because climate change is about the burning of fossil fuels, and we kicked that off, right, on a major scale with the Industrial Revolution 200 plus years ago. That started in this country, it started in my region of the West Midlands, and we have an immense, historic carbon debt. So that is another reason why per capita, greenhouse gas emissions at the moment are not by any means the most relevant statistic. Although it's an argument that will be trotted out at you, as it is to me very, very frequently, UK emissions are only about 1% of global emissions. The problem isn't the problem is the US, the problem is China. Actually, Australia, massive emissions per capita, Canada also. So I really don't think that this is a debate where there's anybody within the broad climate movement who's saying this is about rich countries telling poor countries what to do at all.
Yeah.
I think this is a debate where all of us are saying we have a massive historical debt to current and future generations for the damage that we've caused with our behaviour and the wealth that we've inherited built on that behaviour over the last 200 years. We've got to put our own house in order. And that is why the Green Party isn't saying, zero carbon by 2050, because that's that's broadly what some scientists say. The Green Party is saying zero carbon by 2030. We have to be super, super ambitious. We have to push ourselves because we have that historic moral responsibility.
Yeah. Ms. Nana, I want to question this intuition behind non-violent civil disobedience. So intuitively, we send soldiers off to die in wars because the assumption is that if those wars are not won, then more people will die or there'll be more suffering on net. That's the general public justification behind war. The existential threat that we face from climate change is not in the millions or the hundreds of millions. It probably goes into the billions. Why not commit violence then to get your way? The Earth Liberation Front does it. Lots of movements across the world participate in eco-terrorism. What's the moral intuition behind non-violence?
So that's such a good question. and the answer is that the research seems to suggest, and there may well be problems and critiques around this research, the research seems to suggest, by a woman called Erica Chenoweth, and there's another author, seems to suggest if you are non-violent, you have a greater chance of success. So on a very hard-nosed, fundamental level, if you want to achieve something, if you want to achieve social change, you've got more chance of success if you are non-violent. So basically, we want the biggest chance of success, so it's better for us to be non-violent. That said, would I be violent? That's such a difficult question. It's not. By nature, I'm not a violent person.
Yeah.
Would I be violent to defend my children? Yes, of course I would. Am I a pacifist in that case? No, I would take violence. I would act violently to protect those I love from an immediate threat. It would be very difficult for me to go out onto the streets knowing that I was going to go actively to go and hurt another human being. Are we going to get to the point where the death and the pain and suffering caused by our government's lack of inaction leads to people becoming violent? I think that's a really open question. How much suffering are we prepared to accept as individuals before we start demanding that our governments act in a much more assertive way? Yeah. Where is the line between violence and non-violence? The suffragettes, you've got statues up to them all over the place. In no way were they non-violent. Yeah. Nelson Mandela was a leader of an armed struggle. There is now a statue to him in Parliament Square. So
for clarity, if the social scientific literature in a word said violence is the only thing that works, would you be for it? Because you said it's strategic, right? It's not moral or ethical. strategically speaking, non-violence works. So the social scientific literature pointed towards
Well,
violence.
it's helpful that the literature seems to demonstrate that. Morally, in terms of the moral position of Extinction Rebellion, we are non-violent. You know, so the research underpins our moral position, which is helpful.
Yeah, and I want to bring you in on this because part of the problem that there's several problems in the US, but one of the problems in the US is that every expert has now become politicized. They are either on the left or on the right. And some people argue that the involvement of scientists in Extinction Rebellion, be it in nonviolent civil disobedience or otherwise, politicizes this epistemic community insofar as the scientists are now the people siding with Extinction Rebellion. Do you think that optically impacts how objectively the science is seen behind Extinction Rebellion in any shape or form?
I don't understand the question. I mean, it's not Extinction Rebellion is not a political movement. So scientists being involved with it.
I think some people in the UK might disagree.
Why?
But I mean, for several reasons. One, the composition of the movement. Two, its objectives. If you're planning to change the political system, that's a fundamentally political
It's
position.
not a left-right political movement.
It's beyond politics. It's not siding with any political party at all. I fundamentally, and I will argue that to the death, I would not be involved in a political movement personally. And I'm super involved in Extinction Rebellion, and I believe in it passionately. And I have no interest in politics. I have interest in doing what is right for the country in terms of saving lives. And whichever political party people feel and reading policies has the best chance of moving us forward in a way that helps the climate change agenda, that's what I'm interested in, and that's what Extinction Rebellion are interested in. Just to speak to the compassion side of things, from my take on it is that Extinction Rebellion are actually modelling a new way of being. They're modelling a new type of politics, which is actually based not on violence, not on aggression, not on like hierarchy and dominance, but actually on decentralised power, which has its challenges. And you know, we're brand new, and there's a lot of challenges around that as a movement at the moment because it's new and we haven't got it perfect yet. But we're modelling something completely different. We're modelling a system where people get a say, where people come from their hearts, where people come from what's right and what's truthful and what is the best thing for people. And actually, to me, therefore, regardless of whether it's, I absolutely agree with Sarah that it's helpful that the history supports the fact that non-violence is actually more useful. But on everybody that I know within Extinction Rebellion has that on a moral stance as well. So I'm interested in what you say about Extinction Rebellion being a political movement, because I would absolutely categorically say that's not true.
Fair enough. In terms of like...
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, can I add a question on top of that
Okay.
response? So in terms of modeling this system of change, one of the things which comes out from Extinction Rebellion is the creation of this citizens' assembly. And the citizens' assembly is presumably a set of randomly selected individuals which are representative of different social categorizations, and then they sit together and deliberate over what the best means for changes. If that is the model for change, how does that reconcile, in your opinion, with our current democratic institutions? How does that square in? And two, do you think deliberative democracy works?
So to answer your question very briefly, I think it fits really well with our political institutions, because our political institutions are creaking at the seams and there's an awful lot of massive gaps. And so citizens' assemblies can kind of slot into some of those gaps and help the system work a bit better. And deliberative democracy is really, really, really fundamentally important and a great complement to representative democracy. To just go back to the point raised by Emily there, I'm actually really surprised to hear you say that XR is not a political movement, because that sounds to me like you think of politics as party politics and movements and social change as somehow not politics. And I don't see that distinction at all. I can't remember the name of the guy, it might have been Harold Laswell or somebody like that, who said politics is about who gets what, when, where, how, right? Politics is about how a society decides how to face common challenges, how to divvy up resources, you know, how to operate collectively. That's what politics is. That's why I got involved in it, because I spent 20 years being a protester and working full-time in environment and development organisations and all the rest of it. And I did think kind of party politics felt a bit alienated from it and a bit kind of sick of it and a bit like, oh, the system's broken. And actually, in the end, it was my frustration and my kind of anxiety about the direction my country was going in that led me to say, right, I'm going to get stuck into it. And actually, what politics is about is conversations. It is about knocking on the doors of those people who don't automatically agree with you. It is about standing on the street in my local market town in Ledbury, with a kind of refugees welcome sign, talking to people about that, talking to middle-aged ladies, well-heeled, who come along and say, oh, I'm terribly worried about it, and then they go off, we have a conversation, they go off, and they come back, one of them comes back an hour later and says, I've been thinking about it, and I've changed my mind because of that conversation with you. That sort of experience is incredibly powerful, and that sort of conversation and communication is the only way that society fundamentally changes, through convincing people to share your analysis and your perspective and your ideas about how to change how things work, how those resources get distributed going forward. And so for me, XR is absolutely a political movement because it wants to change how society works. So, but there's no point having an argument about this. Emily, you can carry on believing that, and I can carry on believing what I want, and ultimately it won't really change how we operate. Yeah. But I don't see a distinction between them, and actually I see them as being complementary. So back to the question about citizens' assemblies, that's a different way of doing politics. Now, the reality is, when you get involved in politics, you find that actually the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of the time, don't want to be involved in politics, right? It's like, we've got a borehole where I live, we get our water out of it, but we don't, and I did my PhD on community-led water supply in Malawi, but most people don't want to be spending their time organising community-led water supply. They just want to turn on the tap and for the water to come out. And it's a bit like that with politics, right? You want to live in a society that works fairly and, where there aren't homeless people on the streets and you're not stuffing up the planet and all the rest of it. You want to be able to delegate responsibility for some of that stuff to your representatives. But our representatives don't do that job effectively at all at the moment. That's partly to do with some of the people that we've got elected, not every single one of them, and it's partly to do with the nature of the system. So a deliberative system in which you do this kind of, random stratified selection is a really useful way to do it. There are other ideas. Sortition as a way of organising your kind of your political decision-making group. Yeah. That's another idea. We need to experiment with more of this, and we absolutely, in this country, need to kind of sit back and have a really big think about how can we change politics so people don't feel so alienated, and so it works better for people and for the planet.
Yeah, let's do one last round and then switch to Q&A. So I'm actually quite interested by this. So the Citizens' Assembly, ostensibly, is to fill in the gaps, is to incrementally or perhaps even systemically change the system. But I feel like implicit in what Dr. Chowns is saying is that the current system on some level would exist in concurrence with the Citizens' Assembly. Is that how you foresee it happening, or do you see a complete overthrow and the Citizens' Assembly has almost complete executive authority insofar as these decisions are concerned?
So XR's idea at the moment is that what we want to happen is a Citizens' Assembly is formed using sortition. So sortition is the way of choosing the people who will be represented on the Citizens' Assembly, and then they're stratified from those people who are chosen, so that you get a representation of the country on the Citizens' Assembly. The Citizens' Assembly sits and considers the issue of how would we get to zero carbon by 2025? What plans, what policies can we put in place to do that? And then their recommendations come down to the House of Commons. So the House of Commons, the House of Lords stays in place, and the Citizens' Assembly sits above them and puts proposals forward. And one of the ideas behind the Citizens' Assembly is that it allows our politicians, our representative politicians, to stop being oppositional. Because we've seen paralysis for 3 years around Brexit, because we've got a divided country. We've seen paralysis for 40 years with regard to the climate and ecological emergencies, because it's very, very hard for radical policies to come from representative democracies. Yeah. Because you've got an opposition, they're going to take you to pieces. They see the possibility that if they oppose you and promise not to do these radical things, they will then get elected.
I actually want to push back on this intuition. So if representative democracy is the problem, then why do you still want the House of Commons, the House of Lords?
I mean, if I ruled the world, I would change the way that our representatives are chosen. I would bring in proportional representation so that you actually had the House of Commons also more fairly represented the people, and I certainly have a very good look at the House of Lords as well in terms of the second chamber. See no reason for them not also being representative in some way. Hey, who knows? Maybe we should have a citizens' assembly instead of a House of Lords. There's very different ways that we could organise democracy. I mean, we can upgrade our democracy, right? Just because we have this system in place at the moment doesn't mean it has to stay. It has to stay here. We can see its failure. You know, it's written large across our countryside. We know it. We know it's failed, so we can upgrade it. So, would I personally keep the system exactly as it is? No, not necessarily. Do I see that a citizens' assembly set up very quickly now could work with the House of Commons and the House of Lords? Yes. Do I see it as a way that we can have some kind of unity and a unifying process of moving forward on the climate and ecology? Yes. Because one of the very, very grave risks we face at the moment is that if we did have a radical government in place that was putting forward very radical policies on climate, but you don't take the whole country with you, you end up with a counter-rebellion. So you actually need the agreement, the majority of the citizens, to move forward with the radical policies that are required. And in a way, that brings us back to the first of XR's demands, which is tell the truth. Tell the truth of the nature of the risk that we face. And, moving forward, there is no good news on climate that we face. Like, we are living in the cooler years of the 21st century. It's really only going to get hotter from here. And it's only by actually knowing and feeling the very grave situation we're in that you are able to propose and implement radical action.
Yeah. So I want to take two massive assumptions here. So the first is the Citizens' Assembly is instated, and the House of Commons and House of Lords is somehow bound by their opinions. Let's say the people at the top listen. But then also I'm going to take the massive assumption of the public also has buy-in because of the Citizens' Assembly. Let's say both of those things are true. My question specifically to you as a science communicator is that you are probably acquainted with the concept of public ignorance. So people do not know enough about things. Like I decided for fun to go through Pew attitude surveys for both the UK and the US, and I came up with very interesting things. 2017, 2/3 of the people in the US can't name who the Secretary of State is. 1/3 of them can't name which country is leaving the EU. Like, clearly speaking, there's a gap in public knowledge. So one, how do you reconcile that with these people sitting down with climate experts and coming to the right decision? But two, why won't these people in the Citizens' Assembly be privy to other influences and other biases, just like they were in the 2016 referendum?
That's a challenge. It's an absolute challenge, and we don't know the answers. You know, and Extinction Rebellion don't pretend to know the answers. They don't pretend to have the answers because it's very complicated, and we are not, some of us, the experts in actually knowing what to do. Nobody knows what to do. This is unprecedented. This has never happened before. We as humanity have never been in this state before. We have never warmed this fast. Our carbon dioxide levels have never been this high for at least 3 million years. The rate of warming has not been this fast for at least 2,000 years. So this is completely unknown territory. And yeah, you're right. People do not necessarily have the skills or the expertise to be able to know what to do. But that's the point I believe is that a Citizens' Assembly is about appointing experts to come and speak to those groups, to actually give them the information, to communicate it in a way that they will understand. And those people, I hope, we hope, would be briefed in how to do that. They would use communication styles that can help people to understand it and that can give them the possibilities and the options as to what could happen going forward if we're going to solve this. So I think it's a bit of a sort of straw man argument because we're not actually claiming to know that. I don't think anyone's claiming to know that, and we're not there yet. But Extinction Rebellion came about as raising the alarm. That's all we ever really wanted to do. as I understand.
But
And that this movement towards what to do next is very much, we are, with our own humility, saying, we don't know. But we want other people to be involved so that it's not dictated to, because that's why we've got to get people on board, because we need the people to be the ones saying, this has to change, something has to change. We're not going to put up with, a 67% chance of going to 2 degrees warming and then houses being flooded and crops failing and not getting enough to eat and violence on the streets, which could all happen if we allow things to go. So if we get people behind us, if we get people accepting that this is what's going to happen if we don't make change, then the people are going to be saying, come on, give us some options, give us some information, tell us what we could do. And that's where that's where I think the beyond politics things come in. I get what you're saying, yes, I understand what you're saying politically. Perhaps I'm being a bit naive that, fine, I understand that this is seen as a political movement in that way because it's disrupting what we have as the status quo. But I see politics as kind of suggesting solutions, which we're not doing. We're saying this is a way to get the solutions brought to us by public consent.
Okay, before I conclude the moderated discussion, Dr. Chance, I just want to ask Ms. London something. So let's assume we have the Citizens Assembly. They come up with a solution which is either on borderline atrocious or just suboptimal in some sense. Is there a rebellion against said Citizens Assembly now? What happens? What happens if Citizens Assembly just comes up with a bad solution?
You're very fond of hypothetical questions.
I'm at the LSE, we're very fond of
I think I agree with Ellie. We have enough very real problems facing us. Right now, we have a government which is funding fossil fuel development. We have a government which has, we had a government which banned onshore wind. We've got a government which is overseeing, the decimation of our wildlife. We've had 40 years of inaction. If I had the opportunity for a National Citizens Assembly to come forward, organised in a way so that those participants were educated in critical thinking, had access to experts who understood the nature of the problem we faced and were asked to come up with solutions, I would much rather rely on that finding a solution than the abject failure of a democracy, which historically has not acted for the last 40 years. We've got 40 years of failure. Let's not carry on. So we know we need to do something different. We know democracies do not deal well with emergencies. That's why we had a unity government in 1939, because the country was under an emergency. Across the globe, when there's emergencies, democracies come up with unity governments. So what we need now, because we are facing an emergency, is some way to unify our country.
Fair enough. So on the abject failure of democracy, Dr. Chance, as someone running as a member of parliament, how do you see that? And do you think that democracy indeed institutionally is just under-equipped to deal with a crisis such as this? Or, as I'm sure because you're running, you feel there's a chance for hope there?
I wouldn't have got involved in electoral politics if I didn't feel there was some chance for hope. And I'm blessed as being a naturally kind of optimistic kind of person, but you sort of have to be, because you have to laugh or you cry, you have to kind of be active, otherwise you just fall under a rock. I think there's a couple of things to say. We don't need to be too hypothetical about the Citizens' Assembly, right? We've got one. It's starting in January. It's going to be held in Birmingham. It's organised under the auspices of 6 select committees, part of our existing failing political system, but not all parts of it are totally failing all the time. It's being organised by Sortition. We will see what comes out of it, right? It's the first time, to my knowledge, that such a thing has been organised on such a big scale. I know that things like this have been done in places like Utrecht, on a city kind of level, the same sorts of things. In fact, I think they've been done nationwide in Tanzania on the use of kind of fossil fuel revenues, interestingly. But I think that's going to be a very, very interesting thing to see what comes out of it. But to me, it's not an end in itself, right? It's part of the process. Politics, this is the frustrating thing about the Brexit vote, the idea that you have one vote and all history stops after that. Politics is a continuous process. So we'll see what comes out of that. Might probably be helpful. Certainly won't be the solution to everything. We'll have to keep on kind of fighting for more climate action beyond that. And, you were saying, Emily, about XR's role kind of in this system being about not saying these are the solutions, but about saying this is the problem. Hey guys, this is a real problem. What are you going to do about it? And in a way, that's maybe why I'm involved in the Green Party rather than in XR, because I am interested in what are the solutions. How can you kind of bridge this gap between, there are all these problems, but we need to have a solution, and we need to work within the existing political system to actually quite fundamentally change it. Democracy is really failing. I mean, I'm fighting my third election of the year, my third election of the last 8 months. I got re-elected as a local councillor in May with 80% of the vote in an area that was 80% Conservative 8 years ago. Because people like voting Green when they see what Greens do, and it gives them a nice warm feeling. So, people do change their political stripes, and that gives me hope. I then got elected as an MEP for the West Midlands, and now I'm fighting a general election in a safe Tory seat, in which the guy who I'm fighting against, the Tory candidate, works a day a week, earning more than he earns as an MP, works a day a week, earning 75 grand in a year, helping people move money into tax havens. I kid you not. That is what he does in his not spare time, his time that he's actually paid to work as an MP. So yes, our political system is absolutely broken. If this is the guy who's been representing me in my area for the last 18 years. But there is, I have to believe there is hope. And if anything comes out of the kind of complete sclerosis and disaster of the last few years in terms of the kind of, the Brexit issue, I hope that it is some momentum for fundamental political reform, because we are not going to tackle the big challenges, climate, the nature crisis, the gross inequality crisis, without a really fundamental shift in politics. And part of that has got to be about making it much, much fairer so that everybody's voice is heard. Because even if somebody, like a guy that I spoke to yesterday, who was totally influenced by conspiracy theory clips on YouTube and basically spends his entire life watching them, he does have a right to have a voice, right? And if he isn't engaged in the political process, then he'll just become more and more and more marginalised. So, we've got to have systems that do include everybody.
Fair enough. I should qualify that you're speaking to LSE students, so half of them will be moving money to tax havens. It was a fun, moderated chat. What we're going to have Q&A for something like hopefully 40 minutes. Couple of ground rules. One, it's a question-answer session. Make it a question. At least attempt to affect a high rise at the end of your sentence, so it sounds interrogative. Secondly, I'm going to take men and women in equal measure. So if I don't come to you for a bit, please self-introspect. Having said that, any questions for our esteemed speakers? Go for it.
So I walked in about 20 minutes late, so if this has already been addressed, feel free to ignore it. But in America, we have a lot of think tanks and organizations that are sort of creating false dialogue around climate change and saying that, and they're denying it, and they're actually trying to cite economists and experts and saying that this is actually the death of capitalism is the thing that we should be worried about. And so what do we do about? I don't know if there are parallels in the UK to organizations like that, but what do we do when it's not necessarily public ignorance, but just people being misguided, and when people with a lot of money and power are creating these narratives that we then have to fight against?
Fair enough. Is this question for someone specific on the panel or the panel as a whole? Who wants to take this?
I've got a response to that. So yeah, you've got a big problem with that in the States. We still have it here. So 10 days ago, in the European Parliament, the ECR, which is the Conservative Party's political group, hosted a meeting, a hearing entitled "There is no climate emergency." I've got the documents from it. I went along. Somebody told me this was happening. I went along and I said to these people, what are you doing, basically? And I mean, the kind of, the dismissive, you shouldn't listen to 16-year-old girls, you should listen to scientists. Well, actually, Greta Thunberg's entire message is listen to the science. The IPCC aren't scientists at all. Well, actually, I think you're right, they are. So, we're still fighting against this. This was the Conservative Party's political group in Parliament. Now, when I talk to Conservatives here, they try and distance themselves away from this, but it is still a fight. It's the same as there are still a few random nutters, basically, who deny the link between smoking and lung cancer, for example. But the scientific debate over this is absolutely over, certainly in Europe. And I think in the States, it's your own culture, you're probably better better placed to kind of to judge on this than me. But actually, that message of listen to the science is the most powerful one, I think, ultimately. Listen to the evidence.
Just to specifically answer your question, Ellie's absolutely right. But your question, like, sounds to me is like, well, where do we go to find the science? You know, where do we go to actually know what's true? And I think for me, that's why I'm so passionate about being part of Extinction Rebellion, is that as the science community within Extinction Rebellion, we are doing what we can to basically create resources where the science is there with everything that is peer-reviewed and absolutely solid science. So specifically in answer to that question, point them towards our website. So Scientists for Extinction Rebellion have a website. It's called scientistsforxr.earth, and on it we have an overview of all the science with all the really solid evidence, answering all the questions that are commonly put by climate skeptics or climate deniers. And so my passion, my dream would be that also, and there's also a page on the Extinction Rebellion website itself called The Emergency. They're similar. And so my dream is that becomes a resource where people can actually point people towards and go, okay, you've heard all of that nonsense, you may not know what's true, and you're absolutely right, that it's not just ignorance, it's confusion. There's deliberate confusion being put out there. So it's not that people are stupid and they don't get it, or that they haven't bothered to read, they simply don't know where to go to read the actual facts. So I just want you to know that myself and the other scientists in our community are passionate about making sure that truth gets out there, and that we have resources on the Extinction Rebellion website, and specifically on our Scientists for Extinction Rebellion website, which do just that.
Yeah. Okay, now do you have something to chip in before?
Yeah, I want to say that some of the actions that XR has done have been against the media. So BBC, tell the truth, media, tell the truth, to actually say you have a duty to report what you know to be true, and not to report stuff which is coming out, which is falsified evidence. And also, one of the reasons that we've taken the action we have, the mass disruption, and to be in the street, is that it becomes a story, and it actually means, well, actually, if we hadn't sat in the streets, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. I wouldn't have done Newsnight, I wouldn't have done Sky, I wouldn't have done those, I wouldn't have had those media appearances which enabled me to stand up and to be able to say, this is the truth, you know, this is what is happening. So part of the policy of mass disruption, as well as being economically painful and embarrassing for the government, is that we become a media story, and it gives us the opportunity to say what is happening.
Any other questions?
Okay, so I have two questions for Dr. Jones. First of all, there is a lot of research being published regarding the issue of the connection between inequality and lack of proper environmental policies being implemented. So do you think that at the European level there is done enough to address this issue? And my second question is quite different. You mentioned that like the small actions that we take, by switching off the light, they don't matter that much. But wouldn't you agree that by taking these small actions, we are educating also the general public? I mean, like starting from the young age, people observe how you can somehow improve the situation, and later on when someone is developing, becoming a CEO of a company, he can take proper actions and impact directly to improve the environmental issue.
Yeah, let's take one more question. Peek in the back.
So this is generally to anyone on the panel. You briefly mentioned that XR members here in the UK are somewhat privileged to be able to protest here because of the rule of law. But I was wondering, to what extent would you say that XR tactics are inherently exclusionary towards ethnic minorities, particularly from lower socioeconomic classes who simply cannot afford to get arrested? And sort of related to that, how would you make it a more inclusive model?
Fair enough. Let's start with the questions on climate change and inequality and general public understanding behind what the average citizen can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm really sorry if I gave the impression that small actions don't matter. In the grand scheme of things, turning off your remote doesn't matter very much at all, but actually personal actions really do matter. So, for example, I don't fly. I'm trying to eat vegan as much as possible. Those sorts of things do matter in terms of your personal footprint, and they also matter in terms of the example that they set other people. So the reason I'm moving more towards veganism is because my friend and neighbour is vegan, and I just think, why aren't I doing the same thing, right? So there's a kind of a sales job that individuals do in their own life. My point there was more about the way that XR, I think, has done a really good job of saying, feeling guilty about your own personal choices doesn't help anybody. That doesn't save the planet, right? So try and live the best, most moral, ecologically sound life that you can, but also focus on changing the system so that it becomes easier for everybody to walk or cycle rather than driving in their individual fossil-fueled car, for example. On kind of, environment and inequality, and actually there's a bit of a connection with that thing, although you're talking about at a different level. Is the EU doing enough? No, the EU's never doing enough. And that's kind of the role of a green politician, right? To say, whoever you are, whatever level of government, you're not doing enough. And I think it's really, really important to kind of highlight the connections within these. So it's actually what Greens talk about all the time. So I'm not just banging on about climate on my election leaflet. I'm banging on about a fairer society. And I think that if we sort of think of ecological concern as something that people can only afford to do if they've got a certain level of income, that's really letting everybody down. Totally. And so that's the whole point around the idea of a Green New Deal, basically. We've got to make the transition to zero carbon, but it's got to be a just transition. It's got to be one in which no one is left behind, in which actually we even up society, because, of course, actually the inequality is what's driving a lot of this destruction as well. That classic statistic of 15% of people take 70% of flights, for example. So, these issues of kind of socioeconomic inequality and environmental destruction are really closely interlinked. And just finally on that point that you raised, I mean, I talked to a Bangladeshi woman from Yorkshire about exactly this point, her saying to me, there's a real issue with a strategy for kind of getting political change that requires you to sit in the street and get arrested if you're black, if you're from a lower socioeconomic group. That is not a sort of liberty that you necessarily have. And I think Sarah spoke very powerfully about the need that those of us who have privilege, our moral responsibility to use that privilege in a constructive way. But I think also, it's the people who sit in the street and get arrested for XR that get the attention. But that isn't the only thing that XR is about. There's an awful lot of people involved in an awful lot of ways in XR, in other ways. But I think there's a real moral obligation on all of us involved in environmental movements, whether that's kind of civil disobedience movements, whether that's mainstream politics. I was this morning at the launch of the Nature Conservation Report for the Greens, and we were talking about exactly this issue of kind of diversity within the movement as well. We've got a massive responsibility to actively improve inclusion.
Yeah, before you do come in on this, I actually want to bolster this somewhat. So, Wretched of the Earth has come out quite against XR's, let's call it, lack of diversity in representation. They've been particularly concerned about some comments made with regards to knife crime. Similarly speaking, Green and Black Cross have come out with reports about how XR was fundamentally under-equipped to deal with minorities getting arrested in the April and October protests. So I agree with the general approach. Let's try to help and let's try to make it inclusive. Are there actual things happening within XR as we speak to sort of mitigate this problem?
So Extinction Rebellion operates within British society, and British society is sexist and British society is racist. That is not the fault of Extinction Rebellion. That is the society within which we operate. It's not possible for us. We act and we act to be as open and inclusive as we can possibly be. We are looking at the way that people come into the movement, the experiences that people have within the movement, but we cannot change the way that the police and the judiciary are going to behave towards people who are within that movement. If people here have a better way of forcing the government to take action on the climate and ecological emergency, if there is a path that we can take which does not involve mass disruption and mass arrest, then please come and talk to us about it. It is being discussed. Our tactics and our strategy are discussed. When we take action, we do discuss and these issues are considered. But for us to be able to say that we will be able to take action in ways which are equally open to people, I mean, so for example, it's very hard for me to get arrested because I have caring responsibilities, because I'm a woman. You know, and so I have not been arrested. So I really understand the restrictions that get placed on you because of your sex, because of your gender, or because of your ethnicity. They are there and they are very, very real. But ultimately, if we don't act to stop and halt the catastrophe, the people who are going to suffer the greatest are those people who are already the most vulnerable in the world, and the people whose skins are a different colour from mine are the people on the front line right now. And so one of the ways that I feel my moral responsibility to help that and to help in terms of diversity is to take action to try and protect all of the people of the world. And that will have an impact on those people who are already the most vulnerable. But it's very difficult and I do not have any easy answers to it. But I'm open to those people who do.
I just wanted to make a brief point on the point that a gentleman there about, he's not looking at it, but about personal responsibility.
Mr. Levo wants to answer you.
I just wanted to comment about personal responsibility and just a little point on that from the science perspective. Sorry, I didn't mean to shame you for that. But I was just like, shall I bother? But from the science perspective, it's just 2 points I want to make. One is that we need to be really clear about what personal action actually makes a difference. Turning off your lights at night, turning off your TV remote, really cool difference. I mean, I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm saying don't kid yourself. Like the only thing, like Ellie said, that really makes any difference is flying, ideally not at all. Using using cars, so basically petrol, so fuel in all its types. Consumerism, so we talked earlier about like basically getting stuff from being flown in from factories and basically capitalism itself. I'm not saying capitalism is bad, but the whole consumerism side of stuff, like buying constantly new stuff that's been like manufactured in China, and meat, particularly beef and lamb and dairy. So those, and also yes, insulating your home. But things like turning off your lights at night and that kind of stuff is really, really, and like changing some types of packaging. Yes, you should recycle. But the issue is, first of all, that it could be putting kind of false energy into something that doesn't actually do very much. And therefore not putting your energy saying, well, okay, I'm going to turn off all my lights and stuff, but I'm still going to go to America on my holidays. Like that blows 2 years worth of everything else that you could be doing in your life. Just that, one flight, gone. Like when I realised that, it's like, I travel a lot for work. And usually 5 or 6 at least different countries doing talks, running workshops. I've stopped it all, and I'm not promising I'm going to stick to it. I'm trying what I can, but like when I realised that, I was like, well, it's nonsense to them to fly and then to even be vegetarian but still fly is completely ludicrous. But secondly, more insidious is the fact that if we focus on personal responsibility, we give ourselves a false sense of security, a false sense of pride almost. It's like, oh, well, I'm recycling, my neighbours aren't recycling, so, I'm doing my bit. And that is the biggest block to moving forward, is people thinking they're doing their bit. People going, okay, I've done my thing, therefore I don't have to get on the streets and protest, or I don't have to stop driving my car, or I can do everything else because I've recycled my plastic bottles. So I think it's very, very dangerous if we go down the route of personal responsibility, because actually as a society, we cannot do it without systemic and structural change. And if we're being told to by the fossil fuel companies, we're being told to by the government. They're trying to make us feel like it's our fault. And all the people who are making protesters feel guilty, say, oh, you're protesting on the street, but you've gone to, I don't know, Petamonde for your lunch or whatever, like I do. It's like they're trying to make us feel guilty so that they don't have to deal with the fact that it's actually their responsibility. We live in a fossil fuel industry. We live in a society that is completely controlled and infiltrated by fossil fuel companies. So we can't be expected, of course we can do what we can, but we can't be expected to do what needs to be done when we're living in that environment. It has to come top down.
Yeah, okay. Like this is one good argument not to go back for Eid. Any other questions? I'll take the question back.
they added a fourth demand to their list of three demands, which was climate justice involving a just transition and reparations for people of colour and people in poor communities. If Extinction Rebellion UK had implemented that, who knows whether they would have faced the Canning Town media disaster, because at the core of climate action needs to be climate justice. And if you had that fourth demand, I don't believe that those people would, of their own volition, chose to stop a train in a tube, in one of the poorest communities in London. Like, it wouldn't have happened. So I'm asking you why, you haven't implemented that fourth demand when Excise US has, and when you will go back to, where you're working within XR and ask for that, because it's not there, it needs to be. And even though the science society is divided and is, broken, Extinction Rebellion has no excuse for not moving forward and actually taking action.
Fair enough. I do feel like if the British start paying reparations, there will literally be a system collapse. But I get your point.
Bigger than that.
Hussain, go for it.
So the panel, my question is regarding inclusivity as well. But before that, I just want to give some context as to, people aren't realizing how important it is for individuals outside of the hegemonic white middle class to get involved in this, because the fact is that the global south is experiencing the present reality, whereas you might be talking about the foreboding reality for people, countries like the UK. Lahore was labeled as the most polluted city in the world. The Brazil, Amazon rainforest happened. So my question is really two-pronged. And then you also have headlines in The Guardian which say, when I look at Extinction Rebellion, all I see are white faces. So my question is really two-pronged, which is, number one, how do you ensure Extinction Rebellion does not fall into the category of climate colonialism? And number two, do you not think by repackaging the movement as attacking the injustices of capitalism would be increasing inclusivity much more, as it would make it much more relatable instead of what it superficially appears to be right now, which is decentralized protests carried out by the white middle class? Obviously, I think minorities and people from the global south aren't going to be able to relate to that when they have to worry about how to get their next meal or how to pay for electricity.
Yeah, fair. There's a lot of stuff there, so let's slightly unbox that. So the first is the addition of an objective in the form of perhaps the payment of reparations to minorities who face historical injustices. How do you think that figures in insofar as inclusivity and diversity within XR within the UK is concerned? Anyone?
So the issue in terms of climate justice, one of the reasons that XR is calling for zero carbon in this country by 2025 is based on climate justice, in that we need to reduce our carbon emissions in the most radical way possible, so that what is left of the carbon budget can be used by those countries which historically have not used carbon and which historically may have been colonialised and have suffered due to the impact of the current economic system. And the carbon budget that is left is able to be used by those countries to actually bring themselves up to a level and use the energy to bring themselves up to a level which is such that they can carry on and they can be sustainable, and also they can adapt to what is coming and what is already happening in those countries. So although it's not explicit, well, I see you shaking your head, I don't, although it's not necessarily explicit, it is actually based on the idea of climate justice. And one of the reasons for calling for zero carbon by 2030 at the next COP is for that to be able to happen, is that those of us in the wealthier, more developed countries in the West will have to actually start funding that for it to happen. There's no way that all of the countries around the world have the resources, and they're crippled by debts as well. They will not be able to invest in their structures to be able to get to carbon zero by 2030 without explicit funding and help and the debt jubilees that they're currently under to allow them to meet that. So it's not explicit, but it is actually baked into the philosophy of XR that it has to be based on climate justice.
I'm actually quite curious about this, because if it's true, as you said earlier, that Chinese factories emit carbon emissions because they're making things for people in the UK and the US, surely there's going to be some consumer pattern change in the UK and the US if you're successful at what you're doing. Doesn't that significantly inhibit and impact the economies in the developing world?
Yes, it's good. There needs to be a major system change away from the extractive consumer economies that we currently live within. I mean, we don't just face the climate crisis, which is what this invitation tonight was about, the climate crisis. We are also suffering from a massive loss of biodiversity based on our extractive industries, based on farming, based on our diets and foods. We have a multiplicity of emergencies that we're facing. Mining, quarrying, our extractive industries, they are all impacting massively on our biodiversity. And we need to find a way to be able to live on the planet which actually repairs it and stops harming it. And I cannot sit here today and tell you that I know how that is going to happen. I'm sitting in a room full of economists, right? So there you go. Go and tell me, how do we do that? We know what is needed. We know we need to stop harming the planet by the way that we live on it. What does that economic system look like, and how do we finance it? And I can't remember the number of your question in terms of reparations.
So the idea was that the Extinction Chapter in the United States has added a fourth objective, and that objective is to give reparations to minorities which have faced historical injustices.
So there has been, I do know about the fourth demand, but I don't think that was necessarily the question that came from the chat at the front. But yes, I do know about fourth demand, and there has been a huge issue about the fourth demand in the United States. It has not proved the unifying demand within Extinction Rebellion within the United States. There's been a major fallout within XR in the United States. And so if we are going to move forward with the idea about global justice, we need to take the movement with us. So I'm not saying that we won't introduce a fourth demand. Global justice is important, but how that is encompassed within our three demands or within an international demand, a set of international demands that we're looking at, that is something which is being considered at the moment.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry, I forgot your question. I didn't
So the question, and you can perhaps come back on this as well. Is the idea of creating a broader movement for justice against anti-capitalist movement, and that leads to some sense of transnational solidarity. It's also going to have trickle-down effects insofar as representation and diversity is concerned. So do you think that's a good target to be aiming at to get more representation?
So there's just a couple of things that I'd like to speak to. I guess I've got a question. So my question would be, and this is coming from a genuine place of innocence. I'm not playing a game or anything. Genuinely innocent question is that, what do you think? So this fourth demand, I hear that. Okay, let me address that. So you one of the points you made was that you thought if the fourth demand were there, for example, the Canning Town tube action wouldn't have happened. Personally, I don't think that's true. I don't think so. I don't know, but that was okay. But I'm interested to know why you think that. First of all, why you think that might happen. That's my first question. But secondly, because I'm not sure that that's true. And secondly, is that I would like to know, from pure place of innocence, what you think we could do to get more representation of people of colour, because basically we can only work with the people who want to come and work with us. And I'm not going to be massively controversial saying, well, we haven't got any people of colour, but in terms of spokespeople, in terms of people like ourselves who are standing up and speaking about this stuff, or who are taking active roles, then it's a completely non-sort of centralised, it's complete democracy. It's basically anybody within XR can do anything. So given that, we are at the mercy of the people who literally come forward and come onto the streets and stand up and say, yeah, I want to do that, yeah, I want to do this interview, yeah, I want to be a public face to this, or yeah, I want to take part in policy. Given that, I'm genuinely interested to know, what do you think could we do? It's a sort of catch-22, because you say we need more people of colour in those roles. Well, we do have some people of colour playing in those roles. We can't work with what we haven't got. So it's a bit of a vicious circle. So how could we make it more appealing for people of colour to step forward and say we want to be part of the movement?
Yeah, I think the point was that the reparations objective just works as the incentive mechanism to get people on board. But I quickly want to get Dr. Chance in on this, but go for it.
And
But I
I'd actually like to use a bit of my time to invite you to say what you're desperate to say.
yeah.
Thank you. I think the core of it, I mean, you brought an interesting analogy. I'm sorry for being frustrated earlier. It's just a really important issue for me, and I think a lot of young people. The reason why people of colour, from my experience, and also poor people in vulnerable situations, students that can't get arrested because international students that can't get arrested because they'll be deported. Like the core of the movement is, it's democratic, but ultimately it's kind of like being apathetic towards our democracy. There are things about it that make people distant from it, that make people persuaded from it, that are not. I mean, Extinction Rebellion is not just democracy; it also has other principles, which is why essentially the US proposed that fourth demand, which is having climate justice at the core of Extinction Rebellion. And while it might have fallout in the US, that's something that needs to be addressed. But I think that the fourth demand itself pushes forward that. It pushes forward people's opposition to climate justice. And it wasn't just about reparations, it's also about a just transition. And that's the reason why it also keeps coming out, because it doesn't just affect people of colour, it's whole communities that are dissuaded by it and apathetic towards Extinction Rebellion. It's a real issue that needs to be addressed. And Extinction Rebellion, I'm sure, as you know, is not perfect. So I think that the fourth demand is critical, putting that at the core would make it central and invite people in.
So I want to come back, because I've heard two very explicit suggestions today. And in answer to your question about what can we do, I've heard two very explicit suggestions. One is a fourth demand, articulating that more clearly, and another one is really considering how a strategy that's based around deliberately getting arrested doesn't work in an institutionally racist society. Okay, so for me, Sarah.
No. I'm actually going to. The strategy that XR has used has been incredibly successful.
Let me finish.
No,
Let me
it
finish.
may not be able for everybody to do it, and I accept that. But to say it doesn't work is like nothing else has come close.
You are very
Let
welcome
me
to say
finish.
that after he finishes your point. Go for it.
Let me finish.
Yeah.
I think I've said very explicitly on numerous occasions today that XR's strategy has worked to push climate up the political agenda. What I'm saying is that it doesn't work as a strategy to involve communities of colour. So I think that, there is a responsibility on those of us who have privilege of whatever type it is to really reflect and think, what can we do? Not just say, as a member of the Green Party, we're not diverse enough. And I don't think it would work for me to say, well, I can only work with what I've got with the people that come and join the Green Party. I've actually got an active responsibility, and I'm doing that. I'm using my own personal resources to try and broaden the level of involvement of different communities, historically marginalised communities, in the Green Party. So, we do have a responsibility to do that. I want to draw a contrast between, it seems to me that there's, I've talked about there being horses for courses, right? So if you look at XR, if you look at the school strikes, if you look at the Green Party, we're all working for broadly the same thing, but in slightly different ways. Now, the school strikes, in my experience, are super inclusive. I spent quite a bit of time on school strikes in Birmingham, very diverse city, diverse group of people involved in organising that from all sorts of backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, class backgrounds, whatever. So that's really, really great to see. And it is because, it's a less risky kind of strategy. You're not having to put your bodies on the line. It's really valuable having people put their bodies on the line, but it's not the only way of things. So we can learn from each other, I think, in that. Canning Town, I mean, I really agree that I think that was a gross strategic mistake on the part of XR. And the problem is that when you've got a very kind of decentralised organisation, people say, well, it wasn't XR, it was a few people in XR, but of course it reflects on the whole organisation, and I hope and believe that XR is reflecting on its structure and organisation, because a group that is creating disruption in order to change the system also has to be creating disruption in order to get public attention, and if you only get negative public attention, then you've lost your battle.
Yeah.
So final point on the climate justice and loss and damage. So loss and damage is totally on the agenda at COP25. You know, that is the big issue on the agenda at the moment. This question of what financial responsibility does the broadly rich world have to the broadly poor world for the damage caused by climate change. I'm actually a big fan of the idea of large amounts of money being transferred from the elite, who aren't only in rich countries, to the non-elite through the mechanism of cash transfers to as part of the compensation, the reparation for the historic climate debt that those of us who are part of the elite bear. One final point is the carbon border tax. So the European Union, going to be an announcement of the Green New Deal next week. A big thing that the new mandate is going to try and push forward on is this idea of a carbon border tax. So this absolute idea of if stuff is being produced in coal-fired coal-fired factories in China and then shipped over here, then how do we kind of take account of that? Well, a carbon border tax could be part of the solution to that, because then it incentivises factories wherever they are in the world to use renewable energy without actually penalising the fact of it being in one country or another.
Fair enough. We have 20 minutes for questions, so please give
The question wasn't picked up.
Yeah. Quickly, one sentence rehash, and then we can take other questions. Yeah.
No, as in,
I would love a rehash of your question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my question, so actually when you mentioned that there were only two strategies mentioned, what I said was that would it not be better to repackage the Extinction Rebellion movement as a movement that is attacking the injustices of capitalism to make it more relatable, not only with ethnic minorities but also with the global south? And how do you ensure that Extinction Rebellion does not fall under the category of climate colonialism?
Yeah. Perfect. Let's take a couple of more questions very quickly. Take you in the back.
So in your people who've spent their lives, or spent portions of their lives fighting against climate change, and you're in front of a room of students who ostensibly care about climate change, how would you recommend that a student would devote their life, or at least a portion of it, to fighting their cause, and then they still have a large proportion of their careers ahead? What do you think the best means for the 20-year-old is to go forwards and make changes?
Okay, let's take one more question. Go for it, please.
I have a question for Dr. Grossman. So you talked about that the ideal situation would be there would be no flies at all, and so my question is, who do you think is going to lead the transition? Because it's going to completely fundamentally shift how the global economy works. So, and will XR be responsible for it? Will we take the responsibility to care about what's going to happen to the developing world? Like, who's going to take the lead? Otherwise, I suppose it's going to be chaotic.
Yeah, let's take these chronologically. So one, framing XR as a struggle or movement against the injustices of capitalism. Do you want to take that, Ms. Raj?
So the rationale and the driver behind Extinction Rebellion has not come from an anti-capitalist movement. It has come from people who have looked and are looking at the harm that is being done to our planet and the harm that is being done to us now, and to say we need to do something about this, and we need a system that can operate that no longer harms the world that we live on. And it's not driven necessarily by a philosophically anti-capitalist agenda. It's driven by a planetary repair agenda, if you like. And in a way, I think it's very similar to the philosophy behind the Green Party. So the Green Party is often seen as being a watermelon. So it's green on the outside, red on the inside. But somehow being an environmentalist is merely just a cover for your socialism, and it's a way of putting forward a socialist agenda, with a nice green cover, so people can't really argue against you. Whereas actually the Green Party is, it seems to be the Green Party's drive for equality is also based on its recognition that equality is better environmentally as well. That everything, it's a much more coherent argument than that. And Extinction Rebellion, calling for a change in the system, is based on the harm that that we are recognising that the system does. And in this respect, the communist system has not been a great supporter of the environment, if you like. Communist systems have been just as damaging. Non-capitalist systems have not been beneficial to our environmental health. So we're not necessarily anti-capitalist. And in terms of
the second question was, what can they do as students?
I've just come and join XR because, quite frankly, if we don't succeed, you don't have a professional future in front of you. It's really bleak, and I say this.
That's the best job which I've ever done.
So, yeah. And,
the last question was about flying and the possible repercussions of flying. This was specifically for Dr. Grossman. Feel free to chip in.
All right, but I think that we are not sitting here saying that we know the answers to these questions. We are raising these questions because they have not necessarily been raised in this way before. It's really difficult to say everything you do that we see as being part and integral to our modern day lives. We need to question whether we can carry on doing it or not. And that's very difficult for someone who's standing to be elected to actually put forward those kinds of truths. So I've actually stood for election twice. At no point was I as radical as I am now in terms of what I'm prepared to say. I recognised the truth then, but I was not prepared to say it as somebody standing for election.
So yeah, to pick up on that point, what Sarah said, we don't know. And absolutely, you're saying our XR are going to take responsibility for it. I mean, it's almost like, and forgive me, I know this is not what you're saying, but what I'm hearing is like, well, okay, you say we have to do this, so, are you going to take the consequences? But what we're not saying we have to do this, we're saying, look at what's going to happen if we don't. Really get it on an emotional level, what's going to happen if we don't make those changes. And then you come to us and say, what are we going to do? Not us as in XR, but us as in society, and, come whatever way you want to, and let's try and figure out the solutions together. So I'm not going to take responsibility, XR's not going to take responsibility. We need to take collective responsibility for the fact that if we carry on the way we're going, then we are heading towards a situation where it's not definite, but it's a high likelihood that we're heading towards, mass migrations, societal collapse, economic breakdown, all of these things. And so if people are saying, well, and I know that's not what you're saying, but if there's an argument saying, okay, well, who's going to pick up the pieces? We don't know. But if we don't make the pieces pick upable, then it's all going to self-combust anyway. So it's like, I don't know the answer. I wish I did, and it keeps me awake at night. Trust me. It keeps me awake at night knowing what I know, but it also keeps me awake at night knowing that how on earth are we going to solve it? And like that piece is now going to keep me awake at night as well. It's like, okay, well, we're sort of damned if we do and damned if we don't. And yeah, you're right. If we have to ground all the planes, that is going to be a disaster. No idea how we get through that, but the fact is, if we don't, we're heading towards total disaster anyway. Yep. So that's a challenge. And just in answer to the other point about, what should I do with my life, and Sarah saying join XR, and you kind of making a joke saying that's a job pitch. Quite honestly, I feel really uncomfortable about you saying that's a job pitch because, like I said, regardless of whether XR is a political movement, I don't see it as such, but I understand the different definitions of politics. I don't know anything about politics myself, perhaps I ought to. I see it as something simply that's telling the truth, right? So I'm in it because I want to tell the truth and I want people to know the truth. And then once people know the truth, to me it would be absolutely a no-brainer that once people really do know the truth, you will have no choice but to get out on the streets and protest. Why would you do anything else? So it's not a job pitch. It's not a job. We're not offering employment. It's mostly volunteers. There are some people, it's very public knowledge, there are some people who get a small amount of living expenses so they can do this full time. But fundamentally, what does one do in one's life? Well, you do what you can. And if you're someone who can get arrested, if you're someone who has an ability to... I'm someone who can explain science. So I'm like, total no-brainer for me. As soon as I realised back in April, May, June, that this was real, I was like, total no-brainer. I have to step away from everything else I'm doing, and I have to use the skills that I've been given, that I've been trained to do, which is to give talks about science, and that's all I can do now, is do that. And it's now impacting on all my other projects as well. I give talks about science, loads of other topics. I always now talk about climate change within that. I'm writing books for kids about weird science facts. I'm adding in stuff on climate change. That's what I can do. I can get on the streets in a white coat and lie down. I'm a public face. I will get some publicity, and so I can do that, and I can raise the profile of the movement that way and raise the alarm. So my answer to what do you do is like, look at yourself. Look at what are the skills that you have. Like, what is the talents you have? What can you offer the world? Maybe you're someone who actually can do best by simply, knitting jumpers for people who are on the streets. Yeah. Maybe you're a tailor, or maybe you're somebody who is good at kind of inspiring other people. And so, a friend of mine, who's a women's coach, I went to her recently, and she was like, "Oh, I haven't seen you in a while." And I was like, "Oh no, I'm out saving the world." I was pretty flippant. And she was like, "Oh yeah, I'm helping women to go out save the world." And I was like, "Oh God, of course." So we all do what we can. So I guess my invitation would be to just get really real with what's going on. Get really real with the fact this is real, this is true, and this is happening. And when you get that truth, go, okay, what action can I take, or how can I be of use? How can I be of service to this world that we are in? And how can I make a difference within that truth that is real?
Dr.
And only you'll know that.
You want to quickly come in on someone who offers a the students specifically also.
I want to come in on 2 points.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to respond to the gentleman who asked about whether we should repackage this as, anti-capitalism to avoid the risk of climate colonialism. And before I answer that, I want to tell you that when I hear something like that, my gut reaction is to come back and say, no, but this is mine. And actually, it is incumbent on all of us to kind of sit and try and listen. Why is it that the movements that we're involved in are perceived in maybe a negative or an ineffective light by other people, and what can we learn from that? So I'm offering my response kind of in that spirit of humility, which is, I actually don't recognise the risk of climate colonialism in what XR are doing or what the Green Party is doing. Because from my perspective, I feel these are as movements that are rooted in solidarity. Absolutely rooted in solidarity. And I see that in the kind of, the sort of stuff that Sarah's talking about there, about the sense of this is about a justice issue, although maybe we're not clear enough in each of our spheres in communicating that. But I also see it in the way that people in this country involved in the strikes, for example, are using their platform to amplify the work of people. There's a climate striker in China who does a very lonely job. There are various climate strikers in various African countries who kind of end up on my feeds, and they're there because they get amplified by people who have more of a platform, and presumably they get a sense of solidarity and kind of strength and being part of a global movement. And that's a positive thing. I don't think that's a colonialist thing at all, and I think it is very much coming from a position of solidarity and a commitment to global justice. Maybe we need to be more explicit about that. What's the best way to spend your life? So I've always had I have a rule of three for everything. What?
Drink and drugs, no?
I think I've always thought who asked that question? Pink shirt, yeah. There's three things to bear in mind. Number one, what needs doing in the world? Use your head to work that out. Number two, what are you good at? What are your skills, your hands? So that's kind of head and hands. And the third is heart. What do you love doing? What do you enjoy doing? What is it that you feel a kind of, a sense of motivation to do? And unless you've got those three things lined up, then you're going to struggle some way. But the other thing is, there is absolutely no right answer to this. And all of us, I think, follow these paths that go winding through. I knew that I wanted to work on international social justice, and I spent 10, 15 years working in international development, and then I went and became a bit of an accidental academic and ended up teaching, and now I've ended up being a full-time politician, and I never set out to do that, but I ended up taking that path because I was following my heart and my skills and my sense of what needed to be done at that time. And I suppose just one little word of warning or advice, if I may. So 2 years ago, I was teaching undergraduates, economists, at the University of Bath. I was teaching them a final year module on development finance. And I had some absolutely brilliant students really showing, and it's a topic where you really kind of show that sense of kind of commitment, and definitely a sort of sense of global justice really helps studying that topic. But there were quite a few of them that when I asked them, what are you going to do after you graduate, were saying, well, I'm going to go and work in the city for a few years, and then once I've got enough money, then I might go and do something that I'm a bit more motivated to do in terms of saving the world. And I kind of thought, oh no, because unless you're really careful, you end up kind of wanting to keep up with the Joneses, and you get used to a certain level of kind of privilege, and you can easily get sucked into something. So I think, try and change the world from the start.
Yeah.
You can do that in lots of different ways, but never park your conscience while you kind of pursue convenience.
Yeah. I think that that last comment particularly hit home, I think, for LSE kids. I just want to take one last question, and then we can perhaps segment to the concluding remarks. I'll take it. Go.
Well, it's kind of going back to the social justice issue, but I don't feel that I can comment on the global south and their sense of what is global. I would rather that came from them, the agenda that they want to set. But I'm looking at social justice and diversity and inclusion within London, because that's where I live. And I wonder whether local councils might not be the way to take that forward. Because I work in a school, and we're working very closely with young children, primary school children, to develop children's assemblies on the basis of citizens' assemblies, and giving them the power to look at problems, to find solutions, suggest solutions, and then take actions. But we still notice the lack of diversity, even within our school, of the children who are putting themselves forward, because the values that they often bring from home are such that they're either not interested or they already feel disempowered by the time they get into primary school at quite a young age.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether local councils might not be, as the vehicles for public representation, should they be setting up people's assemblies? Should they be going into their neighbourhoods, even though they're skint, I know, but the money issue, to find out what matters to people locally that they want to take forward? It might not be cars or whatever, it might be a local incinerator or whatever, or it might be something that's happening locally that really impacts on their environment and their children, or whatever cost of living that they've got, that they want to take forward. And the local council is the way to empower those people to act. And if they feel they have been listened to and they can then take action, they may then start to be interested in the more global narrative.
Fair enough. In your answer to that question, would you also individually give a minute each of how you saw the discussion going, whether this was particularly helpful, how you can conclude, all that stuff? So, starting from the right.
So the idea of local citizens' assemblies or people's assemblies is that we actually have a working group within XR who are looking at that. And within councils that have declared a climate and ecological emergency, there's ideas about holding citizens' assemblies within those councils, and we actually are looking at how we can support and enable that to happen. And the beauty, one of the very, very radical things about the citizens' assembly is because it has to be representative of the population, it means that it is an inclusive organisation. So you represent the population as it looks across the nation. So I think that makes them very, very radical in terms of hearing those marginalised voices and allowing them to have an opinion on what gets recommended. So I think, yes, those kinds of councils or assemblies can be very, very valuable and really interesting in terms of how we do upgrade our democracy and what does that really look like in terms of listening to people in communities. In terms of concluding remarks, it's what we face is so very, very grave, and it makes us so very vulnerable because we live in such a complex society. Our supply chains for our food, for the items that we rely on, have grown so very long, And it means that those very, very severe weather shocks that are coming are going to impact upon us. And possibly we now have reached a point where we are going to be unable to stop the future changing very rapidly. Whatever happens, we are going to face huge and immense changes within our lifetimes. And I, as Extinction Rebellion, I can highlight that, but I cannot provide you with the answers as to how we are going to face that. And as I said before, those of you sitting in this room who understand about economies, who understand about finance, who are going to move into banking and politics, you need to start looking for those answers because it's your future. You know, and it's a very heavy burden to put upon you. You know, you live at the most incredible time. You really are the last generation who can impact what our world is going to be like. And now you need to find the courage. It's not about hope. You need to find the courage to step forward and do that. And those of us here now, we will stand with you.
Yeah, I really want to just echo what Sarah said. That was so powerful and beautifully put. And I mean, I feel a double sense of I feel a huge sense of humility and powerlessness because, you know, a lot of the questions that you guys have been answering, I don't know the answers, you know? I don't know much about politics. I know about science and I know about communicating science. And what I know is I know when truth isn't being told. Partly because I'm a scientist, partly because I'm autistic, and it's just something that is just so runs who I am, is that when there is truth that isn't being spoken, or that's being spoken and isn't being heard, and isn't, or is being heard but isn't being acted on, to me it's like death. It's like I cannot rest. And so I feel this sense of, firstly, a sense of like pride at being part of something that is trying to make a difference, but also a sense of complete devastation and despair about the fact that it's not enough. And I know a lot of you guys are wanting to know answers and wanting to know, you know, what are we going to do and what's going to happen next and how are we going to get it more diverse and how are we going to deal with what would happen if we ground the planes and how are we going to deal with... And it devastates me because I genuinely have no idea. No idea. But what I do know is that something has to happen and something radical has to happen and it has to happen really soon. Because yes, we've been warning for 40 years, but actually the window that we have to take this kind of radical action is really closing. We cannot tell you exactly when that window is going to close. No scientist can, that's the whole point. It could close tomorrow. The West Antarctic ice sheet is unstable. And at any moment it could collapse. When it collapses, that's it. We're committed to several metres of sea level rise. That is game over to a lot of people in a lot of parts of the world. Certainly game over to their homes. What happens then in terms of climate refugees? What happens then in terms of civil unrest and conflict and crop failures? Who knows? But it could happen at any point. And the window of tolerance, if you like, is as to when that could happen. Yeah, it could happen next week. It's quite likely to happen in the next 5 years. It's even more likely to happen in the next 10 years. And then what do we do? So, you know, I just want to echo what Sarah says, is that it really is down to every one of us to take action. And you guys are at the forefront of this. You know, economists, people who are part of systems that can actually affect change. I can't make a difference. I can shout as loud as I want to. I can bang on people's doors and say this is the truth. I can try and raise my public profile so that I can speak the truth. I can try and write it in kids' book. But fundamentally, I can't make anything happen. I can simply make people know. You guys can make things happen because you are part of the systems that need to change and need to change radically and need to change very, very quickly. So I think, you know, Sarah's right that all we can do is basically say, do what feels right for you. And I loved what Ellie said about, you know, don't let your conscience kind of get parked whilst you sort of figure out what happens next, because this is when stuff is happening. And also this idea of work out what needs doing. You know, given that this is truth, what needs doing? What needs doing in the world? And most importantly, how do your skill sets, your education, your privilege, your exposure, your experience, what you have access to, who you have access to, how does that how can that help the things that need to change in the world, the things that need to happen? And thirdly, most importantly, how can you, on a personal level, find part of that that makes you get out of bed in the morning and makes you feel fulfilled and makes you feel driven? Because that drive, that awakeness, that vitality, that passion is what will rub off on everyone around you. Whether you're simply working at home in your bedroom and it's one person who comes and makes dinner for you or has dinner with you, or whether it's speaking to thousands of people, or whether it's writing reports, or whether it's being part of a political movement, or whether it's being part of financial institutions. If you are someone who is inspired and lit up by something that you're doing, and you know why you're doing it, and you want to do it, and it fits your skill set, that's a really hard thing to find. It's taken me nearly 40 years and 4 different careers to find that for myself, 5 now. But if you can find that, that's your first challenge. And then when you're in that place, when you're aligned, that's when you can really make change. And that's when everyone around you they'll get it, and they'll fall into it, and they'll make change in their worlds as well. It doesn't have to be big, it can be tiny, but it all adds up.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones.
Thanks. So the question about the role of councils, I'm a local councillor. I do believe that councils can change things. Greens are now in shared power in Herefordshire, and we've stopped the building of a bypass, or at least paused it. That's a really good thing to happen. But I wouldn't put all of my faith in councils as the places that this is going to happen. Change has to happen at all political levels, and actually councils, local elections in the UK, typically about 1/3 of the population participate in elections. Typically less than 1/3 of members of councils are women. A much lower percentage are, from ethnic minorities or from, different sorts of backgrounds. They are basically old, white and male, largely councils still. So they're not going to be kind of the solution to the problems that we have of inclusion and so forth. Plus, they've had the rug pulled out from under them over the last 10 years under austerity, 40% cuts in funding across the board, essentially. And so they're pared down to the bare minimum. But councils are part of the solution. That's why I'm part of one of them. And I would massively, strongly encourage you, any of you who have a glimmer of an idea that you might be interested in changing the world politically, get involved in politics. Stand for council. We need far more young councillors, for example. We need people to get involved at all levels in politics. And it's frustrating, and there's lots of boring meetings and dusty old kind of wood-panelled rooms, but you can make a difference to individual people's lives through those conversations as well, and at a level of kind of how money gets spent, which is what politics is about. Back to my original point. Quick reflection on this evening. First of all, thank you all very much, right? I think there's been a fantastic level of engagement and kind of, attention and interaction in the room. And I actually haven't felt that I've been kind of asked to produce answers. I feel that I've been asked to reflect on some really interesting observations and questions, and asked to look at things differently, and that's been really helpful. And I've learned a lot from my co-speakers as well, so thanks to all of you, and great chairing, Hamza. I'm always a little bit wary, and especially over the last year, there's always been a bit of a tendency of, we can put our faith in the young. Now 25 years ago, it was me on the other side of this, and I remember at that time the faith being put in the young to, climate change, we've got to solve it, and young people are going to kind of lead the fight against it. And now, of course, we're middle-aged people, and you're younger people largely, and I think we really mustn't have this kind of us and them, and your generation must be the one that changes it. Particularly with the school strikes, it's fantastic that young people are doing that. My own son's been massively inspired, nothing to do with my own engagement in politics, he's massively inspired by the people he sees on Insta. And so that's what makes him go out and do school striking. We've all got to work together, and I think that we need to be really careful in all of our roles to, it's not even about careful, it's about this is the way it should be. It's us, we, together, facing the challenge of kind of reorienting our society and our economy so it works better for people, and so it is in tune with the planet, and so we don't stuff things up for whoever might come after us. And we've got to be very careful of anything that could lead people to feel that it's an us and them thing, that we were chatting with my friend Georgie earlier about, outrageous Christmas decorations everywhere. But if you tell people they can't have them, they'll be totally up in arms, right? So, but they really shouldn't have them in a sustainable world. But we've got to find a way of kind of creating common cause together. So all of us working together, appreciating our different approaches as well. And I'm not personally motivated by fear. I can kind of see that, but I've got a close family member who is basically flattened by existential fear, and as a result can't find the energy to engage in changing that potential path. And so for me, it's about saying, look, we can have a better future. There are lots of valuable things in our society already. We can build on them. There's lots that we've got to change. And we can have a vision of all of us being happier and healthier and more community-oriented and better relationships and a different version of well-being and prosperity, if you like, through us together.
Perfect. We are better off for listening to you, and we enjoy you as our parents. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to echo that. That was really a fantastic call to arms, not literal call to action from everyone on this panel today. A few thank yous from me. Firstly to Dr. Perkins, our academic chair, for supervising this event. We are very, very grateful. To all the organising team at LSE Debate for making sure that this event was possible. Thank you very much. To our panellists and to Hamza as well for making sure this discussion happened in such a productive manner. If you did enjoy this and you were interested in this, there's a lot more to come from LSE Debate when it comes to our public debate series. So if you want to give our Facebook page a like, or you want to sign up to membership and get our newsletters, you will see many more events like this on a range of issues as we continue the Fabian series into Lent term. Thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you.